What do you get when you send 3 men and a rope up a mountain? 2 men. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Line. Mount Rainier is one of the tallest mountains in the contiguous United States. Known as Tahoma by the Sahaptin-speaking tribes of the region, Mount Rainier has in later years become a scenic destination, a place where hikers and climbers will go to really test their mettle on a mountain that, while not, Mount Everest, is unforgiving to inexperienced climbers. Known as Tahoma by the Sahaptin-speaking peoples of the region, Mount Rainier is part of the Plateau culture area. The Sahaptin speakers are the most recent inhabitants of the area, including groups like the Yakima and Nez Perce, but these cultural groups also don't believe they were the original inhabitants of the area. Rather, when they got there were already old Indians, to use their terminology, inhabiting the region who knew stories of the time before the arrival of the Sahaptin. But as a result of these groups living on the mountain, many of the passes, climbing routes, and surrounding areas, even down to the glaciers, are in fact named after various Sahaptin and coastal Salish, I believe is the word, coastal Salish tribes. So you get things like Nisqually Pass, for example, on the mountain. Nisqually Glacier? It's either Nisqually Glacier or Nisqually Pass. That's not central to the story we're telling here. Today, however, Mount Rainier sits at the center of, as one would imagine, Mount Rainier National Park. It's the 5th tallest mountain in the continental United States, sitting at 14,417 feet, and it is very popular for climbers. And it has been since the first documented ascent by 2 people by the names of P.B. Van Trump and Hazard Stevens, which are just, those are names, let me tell you. But we're not talking about P.B. Van Trump or Hazard Stevens. We're talking about another guy who attempted to summit via the same route and never came down. This, my friends, is the story of Eric Lewis, a 57-year-old who thought he could conquer the mountain on a day when absolutely nobody should have been trying to conquer the mountain, including his friends. Now, very little information is available about Eric Lewis as an individual. With Paul LeMay, we had a wealth of knowledge to go off of. Eric just appears to be a very experienced climber who, at age 57, figured he could do it. And on any other day, he probably could have. In fact, he had proven that. He had summited Rainier at least 10 times prior to this expedition. But the thing about the route that he took is that it's not really recommended as a summer climb. And on July 1st, Eric Lewis and 2 companions, Don Storm Jr. and Trevor Lane, began their ascent up the Gibraltar Ledges route on Mount Rainier. Now, the Gibraltar Ledges themselves aren't a particularly difficult climb if taken at the right time of year, which is December, January, and February. In July, however, loose rock, ice that isn't quite as packed down as one might need it to be, and other various issues make it a much more difficult climb. And on this specific day, July 1st, 2010, visibility was only about 5 feet in some places, and the winds were extremely high, 40 to 50 miles an hour. So even attempting this route was just a huge mistake. But normally, it's only an intermediate alpine climb with a grade 2 difficulty, which, I'll be honest, you and I probably know what that means about the same amount. I have no idea what any climbing terminology is, so I looked it up, and grade 2 is not supposed to be super hard. However, this route does include snow and slopes with a grade of about 50 degrees, which is a lot. The route requires crampons, axes, and ropes, and a bunch of other gear is recommended, such as helmets. It's not clear exactly what Eric was wearing at the time that he went up the mountain, but it's believed he was wearing his normal climbing gear, his backpack, his crampons, had his axe, he was connected to the rope, and that he was wearing a helmet. So he was outfitted for this climb. And a climb it is. This route goes up 9,010 feet. It begins around 4,000, 5,000 feet, which is why, there's only a 10,000 foot actual climb. Point of the matter is, it is a hike. This is almost 2 miles, just up. Of course, going back and forth, it adds even more. But you're going 2 miles into the air. Like, this is not simple. You're talking about elevation sickness. You're talking about temperatures that drop considerably. It's just not a good thing to do if you are not in the proper season. And again, they weren't. Despite the absolutely horrendous conditions in which they were climbing, however, Don, Trevor, and Eric, in that order on the rope. Don was the lead climber, and then attached to the same rope as him, a few meters below, was Trevor, and then several more meters below that was Eric. And the way that this climb worked was Don would climb for a while, stop, wait for Trevor to catch up, Trevor would wait for Eric to catch up, and then they'd begin moving back up the mountain. They made it to nearly the 14,000 foot mark, about 13,900 feet. When they noticed something was off, Trevor stopped, after Don had stopped, of course, and he realized Eric was not getting any closer. So after several minutes, and we're not talking about them hanging onto a vertical cliff face, we're talking about, they're at most 50-degree slope. Still, not the easiest thing in the world, but they noticed Eric is not getting closer, and the rope feels a little slack. And what ended up happening was, after a few minutes of this, of not seeing or hearing Eric, they yanked on the rope, and absolutely no tautness whatsoever. So they pulled the rope all the way up, and what they discovered was, despite seeing Eric just minutes prior, Eric was not attached to this rope. Now, if you, for example, read the Missing 411 books, they're going to tell you that Eric had been cut off the rope. In reality, he was wearing a carabiner and had unclipped from the rope. Is that less strange? No, but it's a considerably different kind of strange. This means Eric deliberately unclipped himself, not that he was torn off of it. The very first thing that Don and Trevor did was sweep their immediate area. Anywhere that rope could have reached with Eric attached to it, they checked. And what they found was that Eric's footprints went up to a certain point, around 13,800 feet, and then disappeared. There were no footprints going back down. There were no footprints going up, none going to the side. They figured maybe somehow he did skirt us. And so they ascended it, they got to the summit, and they checked around, and lo and behold, no Eric, no footprints, no suggestion he had been there. At this point, they realized something probably is up, and we need to get help. So they descended about 4,000 feet down to Camp Muir, where this sits at 10,200 feet, by the way. And there they contacted rangers, and they said, look, our friend Eric unclipped from the rope. We don't know where he is. He's missing. Can you help us find him? And immediately, a team of 3 rangers began ascending up to the summit to look for Eric. This team was led by climbing ranger Tom Payne, and he and his team actually reached the summit of Rainier. Again, this is July 1st, so you can think about sunset and sunrise here. They reached the summit at about 8 p.m., so it still would have been a little bit of daylight. They checked around for him, found nothing that Don and Trevor had not already found, and then around 10 p.m., they made it back to Camp Muir. Camp Muir is the most commonly used shelter area for climbers attempting to summit Mount Rainier. It consists of a single one-story shelter made out of stone, and then several outbuildings, toilets, and stuff like that. The shelter itself is a 12 by 25 foot stone room. It's actually very pretty. I'm sure there will be a picture of it next to my head. But point is, it's nothing super special, but it's sturdy. Now, while Tom Payne and his team were up the mountain searching for Eric, the other rangers sent for supplies because they had a feeling they were going to need to launch a more intensive search. So they had supplies shipped up the mountain to Camp Muir, and the next morning, a search would begin in earnest. On the morning of Friday, July 2nd, a team of about 40 searchers on the ground started looking for Eric. This included both professionals and volunteers, and amongst those professionals, it included actual National Park Service climbing rangers, as well as climbing guides from the Rainier Mountaineering Company, Alpine Ascents International, and the International Mountain Guides, as well as a number of just climbing volunteers. As the ground searchers did their thing on the mountain, a couple of helicopters circled in the sky equipped with infrared tech. One of the helicopters was a CH-47 Chinook, which was from nearby Fort Lewis, and the other was a helicopter on loan from Northwest Helicopters, which is quite a descriptive name. Thanks, guys. One team of climbers, which was focused on the actual spot where Eric went missing, between 13,000 and 14,000 feet, did locate his backpack at about 13,600 feet, and then found an ice cave at about 13,800 feet. Many versions of this story that you listen to or read will tell you that the backpack was found inside the ice cave. It was not. However, the ice cave is about where they last saw Eric, which leads to some questions. And we'll get to those questions, but first I need to point out that the other 3 teams, which were searching nearby, and then the 4th team was actually searching the Emmons route, which is on the northeast side of the mountain, so a little bit away from Gibraltar Ledges, which is on the southeast side, but still within the area that Eric might have ended up. So that fourth team ascended the Emmons route and then hiked their way over to the descent route for the actual Glacier Ledges route. I'm using the word route a lot here, I'm sorry. They headed over to Ingram Glacier, or Disappointment Cleaver, are two names for this same spot. Anyway, they didn't find Eric in either of these spots, and nobody on the other route found Eric either. All they knew was backpack at 13,600 feet, snow cave at 13,800 feet, Eric missing by 13,900 feet. That was all the information they had to go on. And nobody found any footprints either, outside of the ones Eric left going up the mountain. On day 3, a couple of rangers skied down the Gibraltar Chute looking for him, and this is a ski route that starts at 12,650 feet and goes down to 9,616 feet. It's one of the ways of actually getting down, as well as one of the ways of getting up the Gibraltar Ledges route. Scouting it, they found no signs that Eric had actually been on this route, that he had gone down it, tried to go up it. There was nothing. While this happened, another team of searchers focused on the Nisqually Glacier, which is just to the southwest of the Gibraltar Chute. And they didn't find anything there either. But what they were checking for at this point was signs of a fall. Any shot that he had landed in the snow somewhere, rolled down the mountain, but they didn't find anything of the sort. There were no imprints, no footprints, no slide marks, no body marks, no blood, nothing to suggest that Eric had fallen down this route. And they checked the entire fall radius from where he was. If there was a spot that Eric might have slipped, fallen, and tumbled down the mountain, they looked there. By the end of day 3, having made absolutely no progress, and with extremely high winds and lots of precipitation rolling in, they just had to call off the search. And they knew that if they hadn't found Eric by then, without his backpack and any of his supplies, it was extremely unlikely that he had survived to this point. And looking for a body in that kind of condition was really just going to put the Rangers and the Mountaineers in more danger than it was worth. So, Eric's body has not been found, and several questions do still remain. For example, why did Eric unclip himself from the rope? He never tried to signal distress, he never called up to anybody, there was no reason given, they didn't find any signs of distress. What was his reasoning for unclipping? You know, it's not uncommon for a climber who is in distress and concerned that their position will lead to harm to their companions to unclip from a rope or to cut themselves loose. But there was no sign that anything was wrong. And his disappearance, while sudden, does seem to have been deliberate, because he took off his backpack and left it at 13,600 feet. Did he make it to that snow cave? We don't really know. But why did he remove his backpack? And then you have to ask the question, was there any relevance to that snow cave? While Politis and Strange Outdoors and some of the other people who have told this story have said that the pack was in the cave, the contemporary reports don't reflect that, and neither do the National Park event reports. I read through them. They don't say anything about the backpack being in the cave or any of Eric's gear being in the cave. They just note that there's a cave. If they noted there was a cave, it does imply that there's some significance to it. Maybe they were concerned that Eric had crawled into it seeking shelter from something, or that something in the cave had dragged Eric up there. But there's no evidence for that either. There's no tracks leading up to that cave. There's just a cave. So why then would Eric have unclipped, and what reasoning for unclipping would have resulted in him not being there at all anymore? I mean, in order for him to get blown so aggressively off the mountain that he didn't leave any tracks, we're talking about winds that simply weren't there. It sounds like, you know, at that point, it really does sound like something had picked him up off the mountain. If it had been something as simple as him having a heart attack, he would have unclipped and his body would have been found there. If he had been attacked by some sort of wild animal, there would have been a sign of a struggle, likely jerking on the rope. There would have been some sign that something was wrong. Instead, Eric just disappeared. And that begs the question, where did Eric go? Searchers checked every possible alternate route, and we're not talking about an area with lots of trees or anything, but they did check into the crevices. In fact, this would not be the first time that somebody fell into one of these crevices, so they knew to look there, and they didn't find him in any of them. Where if Eric was in a crevice, it was somewhere that was not on the actual fall route. He must have hiked somewhere else. But if he hiked somewhere else, where were his footprints, and why did he leave his backpack? Eric was not in the snow cave. Now, I couldn't find too much information on how deep the snow cave was, but he certainly was not within the searchable area of it. As I've said before, he left no footprints, and even if he did take shelter in the cave, why did he choose to leave his backpack 200 feet below that point? That doesn't make any sense either. If he was concerned about something, so much so that he had to unclip, did he keep climbing? And if he did keep climbing after unclipping, why leave his backpack behind? Did he take off his backpack and continue climbing? Did he feel like he couldn't carry his backpack and maybe he could reach his friends? If so, why aren't there any footprints? And why not tug on the rope? Why not signal for help? It's not that there's no possible explanation for how any of this happened. It's more that each explanation seems to contradict on some level. If he was in danger, why didn't he call for help? If he had a heart attack, where was his body? There's no explanation for this that is perfect. And finally, the police didn't seem to think there was any sort of foul play. There was no motive for Don and Trevor to hurt him. And again, they were the only 3 people on that part of the mountain. So in order for it to be foul play, they would have had to cover their tracks really well. And then there's the possibility that maybe Eric wanted to disappear. But why would he wait until 13,600 feet up the mountain to try and do that? And why leave the only possible way that he would survive, his backpack with his tent, his gear, his food, his water, why leave that behind? He'd then have to make a 10,000 foot, well, 9,000 foot at the very least, descent down Mount Rainier with no equipment if he wanted to disappear. So if nobody hurt him, he didn't hurt himself, and he's not in any of the crevices or caves that they searched, what could possibly have happened to Eric? Nobody knows. A lot of people have suggested that this was a cover-up. His friends killed him and hid his body somewhere. And that seems to be the most likely possibility. Maybe he was shoved into that snow cave. Maybe they're the people who left the backpack. But without a motive and without any evidence that he was dragged into that cave or anywhere else on the mountain, that doesn't really add up. In fact, nothing adds up, which is why this is one of the missing 411 cases, and it's one that honestly did not need to be altered to be weird. We don't need to say that the backpack was in the cave for this to be a weird story, so I'm not sure why people are changing details around, or maybe they just heard anecdotes that they decided to include without fact-checking. Point of the matter is, it's a weird case, and there's really no good explanation. But we'd love to know what you guys think, so let us know in the comments. If you want to support the work we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can check us out on Patreon. You can get access to our exclusive content over there for just $1 a month, including monthly drunk folklore and drunk history videos, where I drink bourbon and then talk about subjects I find interesting. It is a great time. You can see some previews of that in our shorts, as well as one that we're going to be coming out with soon that'll be edited from the actual video itself, not just me pointing my camera at my laptop. So, if you want to check that out, it's over on Patreon, as well as some other goodies and fun stuff. I'm going to be uploading my notes once they're compiled. And then, if you want to check us out and support us via other means, we have an Amazon storefront. We have our coffee, Mount Pocono Perk, which you can get from Tableau Roasting Company. We have a partnership with Target. I'm wearing a Target shirt right now. It's very comfy. I highly recommend it. Or, of course, you can always just, I don't know, watch and share the videos. That's pretty easy and simple. So, if you want to support us, those are the ways you can do it. Thank you for watching the video. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.